So, at the studio with Kitchen Theory, we have Gustav Kuhn. Gustav is a reader in psychology at Goldsmiths and author of Experiencing the Impossible, the Science of Magic. He's also the president of the Science of Magic Association and a member of the Experimental Psychology Society and the Magic Circle. Today, we're going to be discussing sensory dining, the science of magic, and how the two may possibly relate. Gustav, thank you so much for coming into the studio. We obviously got connected through Professor Charles Spence at Oxford University, and I just found out now that even though the three of us are in the process of publishing a paper together, you've only actually known him for roughly about 6 weeks or so. So that paper's come about pretty quick.
It's been very, very rapid.
So what you study the psychology of magic, and what kind of a science is there behind, or what is the relationship between psychology and magic?
Well, I mean, psychology underpins all of our human experiences, but magic is quite unique in that it allows us to experience the impossible. And by doing so, it deals with some of the most fundamental psychological and philosophical questions. It deals with consciousness, it deals with deception, beliefs, free will. And yet, I think unlike most other art forms, it's received relatively little scientific interest. And what we're trying to do is using scientific methods as a way of understanding why and how magic works, because by exploring some of these principles, we can learn a lot about how the human brain works. So magicians have developed lots of really clever psychological tricks to fool us and create impossible experiences. And as psychologists, we're generally interested in understanding why our brain is tricked, because once you understand why your brain is tricked, you can work out how the brain actually works. And so a lot of our research tries to understand the psychological and neurological mechanisms that underpin a lot of these illusions.
And how does this research, what could it possibly help us with understanding that we could find maybe practical or functional in a day-to-day world? Like what are we learning from this? So to give you an example, with the research that we're doing, let's say with Professor Spence, understanding people's sensory relationship with food in some way may help us with designing maybe better food experiences, or the understanding that we have with, let's say, people's perception of color and taste, or sounds or smells, and how that relates to their experience of food could, let's say, help us with developing, let's say, better food for children or better food experiences for the elderly in care homes. Understanding the psychology of magic, what would that lead to better magic, or is there another purpose behind it?
I mean, the main purpose of this is not to improve magic. We are studying magic to help magicians as well, but that's very much a small sideline project. Mm-hmm. Our main motivation is to find ways in which we can apply the knowledge that we gain from understanding the science of magic to other domains as well. So, for example, we are studying misdirection and magicians' ability to manipulate what you're seeing. And what this tells us is that we experience much less than we intuitively think that we do, and this has got very important implications for road safety, for example, or any other kind of task where your attention is being distracted. We can think about magic as manipulating your conscious sensory experiences as well, and so in a similar way that Charles Spence's work on cross-modal perception has important implications for dining experiences, some of these subjective experiences could likewise be implemented in a dining experience, or human-computer interaction. So we are now using magic, trying to understand some of these magic techniques to see whether we can implement these principles in a gaming environment, or enhancing our human-computer interactions as well, or even the deep-rooted emotional experiences that magic elicits. So we've got a project where we trying to see whether we can apply magic, so the experience that magic elicits, but also the process of learning to perform magic, the impact that that can have on people's mental health and well-being. So the overarching aim of the Magic Lab is to try and understand the psychological mechanisms that underpin magic, and then apply this knowledge to domains that are outside the traditional entertainment industry.
And to what extent would you say magic is a multisensory experience? So I guess when I think of magic, I think of a lot of it being visual, maybe tactile in some way, sound probably playing a role, but would you say that it extends into the other senses, or that it's a multisensory?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because a lot of magic is visually based. That doesn't necessarily mean that other sensory experiences don't play a role in magic. Most magicians don't perform in silence, they use music or they talk, so that automatically incorporates the auditory domain. You can use other, so tactile sensory experiences, especially close-up magic that happens very close up. Magic can happen inside the spectator's hands, or if you think about a pickpocket, for example, where the pickpocket won't just exploit loopholes in your visual perception, but also your tactile perception as well. Sensory sort of taste, less so, I'm less aware. So, but although a lot of these other sensory domains play an important role in creating the magical experiences, I would argue that most magic is very heavily visual based. And there's some interesting performances that are carried out for blind people, for example. So it doesn't mean that. I think you can have magic that can tap into other sensory dimensions, but 99% of the magic is performed for the visuals.
And so based on, I guess, the paper that you, I, and Charles have put together, it was really interesting to see that throughout history, food and magic seem to have kind of coexisted in terms of they're both really popular forms of entertainment. Magic, in many cases, typically kind of is performed in for audiences that are dining or eating. That seems to be a popular kind of form of entertainment as part of a dining experience. But the two don't ever seem to have really come together in a meaningful way up until now.
No, and I think that's a really interesting question in terms of why, because throughout magic, or definitely in modern times, magic and dining have gone very closely together, but I think they've been on very much parallel tracks rather than actually interacting with each other. So today, the bread and butter work for most working magicians is table hopping magic, or performing at receptions where you've got people dining, and then between courses a magician will come and perform some card tricks or some other magic tricks, or in bars. So bar magic is quite a popular form of magic as well. So you've got magic performed in dining and culinary experiences, but also the actual props that magicians use as well. So magicians will perform with spoons, forks, or fruit, or any object you can think of. If I think back on during my magic, my typical magic repertoire, I will make lemons appear, and I borrow a banknote, and that appears signed inside a kiwi fruit. These are all culinary items, and yet I can't think of many magic tricks or experiences where the magic and the dining properly complement each other, and I think that would be something that's really interesting to explore.
I think one interesting point that Professor Spence had highlighted, or maybe it was was about a magician called David Devant, who they had a show entitled A Feast of Magic at St George's Hall in London, and one of his tricks, he brought onto stage an ordinary looking kettle, and moving to a tray of glasses, he poured out a dozen glasses in quick succession of sweet gin, claret, port, chartreuse, water, and a few other, milk, I think was what he ended it on. So I guess food has kind of played a role in that sense, and people got to taste it, but I don't think as chefs maybe we've brought magic, or the kind of more technical aspects of magic into what we do. But I think food and magic, again, this is what we were talking about earlier. I think there's something interesting about the two in terms of they're all about transformation. There's something very important about the amount of effort and time that goes into, and practice and skill that goes into creating a great magic trick. And I think there's something very similar or parallel there when it comes to producing a great dish. There's an awful lot. If you want a beautiful dish of food, the holy grail is doing something really simple, or it is at least appears simple. And I think in order to do that, you need that skill, that practice, and an awful lot of work has gone in to create something that looks simple, and there's something magical about that.
Yeah, I think the parallels between magic and cooking are very striking. If you think about the magical transformation, a simple object, simple ingredients that you then magically transform into a beautiful dish. So there's that side of it. In terms of the amount of work and thinking that can go behind a dish, it's similar to a magic trick as well. A magic trick often will appear very simple, but has taken years of practice and thinking and theorizing behind it. But then also the whole performance aspect and the the multisensory experience of dining as well, in that, of course, you don't just taste the food with your taste buds, but it's also a visual experience. You want to have a dish that looks nice. The presentation plays a very important role in the dining experience, and that is really just an illusion. It's an illusion that's very similar to the illusion that the magician's trying to create.
So one dish that I think we do so I was watching your Google talks, and you talked about the duck and rabbit illusion, which was the inspiration behind one of the dishes that we have on our menu. What interests you in a visual illusion like that?
What's interesting about the duck-rabbit illusion is that it illustrates the importance of the way that our brain really interprets sensory information. We think of vision as simply being about capturing information with our eyes, but of course vision, as well as all other sensory experiences, are experienced by our brain rather than the primary sensory organs. And what the duck illusion illustrates is that you can interpret the same situation in very different ways. So you look at it, and either you see it as a duck or you see it as a rabbit. Although the visual world, the physical world hasn't actually changed, your experience of the world is dramatically different. And what this illustrates is that our experience of the world is much more subjective than we intuitively think it is. And since it's subjective, we can start playing around with it. And that's what magicians do. They manipulate that conscious experience so that they can create the illusion of impossibility.
See, that's an interesting point, because a few times now you've mentioned about this idea of kind of manipulating the senses, and I guess we have been, and I guess because coming from a food background, you're super aware of this idea of not wanting to manipulate people, or at least, for us, I guess our approach is to look at how augmentations or changes in the sensory environment can in some way influence people's perception of flavor. But I guess as chefs, you tend to want to steer away from this idea of manipulation. It doesn't really have a very good connotation. Maybe making yesterday's or last week's fish a little fresher by putting, let's say, the sounds of the sea on and doing something like that wouldn't really be the goal. The goal would be, I guess, for us to enhance what is already kind of great produce in some way. Why is it that people will accept manipulation in one kind of art form so readily? What is it about magic that allows us that we want to be deceived? We don't want to when it comes to sitting down in a restaurant, but when it comes to sitting down and being entertained by a magician, we willingly want to be deceived. Why?
I mean, I'm not sure whether there's that much of a difference, because although maybe it's just semantics, because of course what you're doing as a chef is very similar to what you're doing as a magician. I mean, you are deceiving the audience or the diner. You just don't call it deception when you put the food on a plate in a beautiful way. You are playing with their expectations, and you're manipulating the way that they will afterwards enjoy their meal. And in some ways, magicians are doing exactly the same thing. But I think intuitively we think, well, we don't like to be deceived, and magic is a very weird art form in that you are watching someone who's blatantly lying to you. I mean, when I'm performing a magic trick, I'm very open about the fact that I am deceiving my audience, and yet people enjoy that. But I think it's the same in a lot of art forms. When you go to the cinema, you go and watch a film, you know that it's not real, and you are allowing yourself to be deceived. And I can imagine it's the same in a dining experience as well. When you've got your pork sausage, well, you want to be deceived because you don't really want to see the pig on your plate. So I think I don't think it's the case that we don't like to be deceived. When you ask someone, well, do you like being lied to or do you like being deceived? Well, the intuitive answer is no, but actually the more that we learn about how the human brain works, we've also come to realize that there's lots of situations in which we are completely willing to accept certain forms of deception. If you think about most social interactions are based on a certain level of untruths as well. We often use little lies to facilitate a lot of our social interactions. And so it doesn't mean that deception has got, and manipulation has got very negative connotations, and because they can be used to exploit people. But in actual fact, a lot of the time we use these forms of manipulations to enhance people's experiences. So I don't think deception needs to be considered as being a purely negative construct.
And when it comes to, let's say, the idea of entertaining people and how important is emotional engagement? Because at the dining table, engaging people emotionally, taking them on that journey is super important. And I remember a little while ago, as a team, we were thinking about all the different emotions that you could take people through as part of this kind of journey. And the obvious ones that stand out are kind of nostalgia and happiness and fun and very positive kind of emotions that you want to stir in people. But we also wanted to tap into emotions that were maybe a little less explored during dining experiences. So things like disgust. Now, not in a way that we actually want to make people feel disgusted by what they're eating. The food, actually, if you're playing with an emotion like disgust, the food has to be really, really great to kind of balance it all out. But it's just eliciting that notion or that in the mind more than actually in the mouth. So it's not disgust about what they're actually putting in their mouth. That tastes delicious, but it's maybe a perception. So, even if you look at one of the dishes that we have is based around jellyfish. So just using that as an ingredient, because of the perception that most people have about jellyfish and the connotations that they have linked to jellyfish, there is an element of disgust that comes into their mind when they first think. It's the same with insects, let's say. There's an initial hesitance for most people, especially Western palates, especially here in London. Something like insects or jellyfish seem a bit obscure. So there is that kind of initial hesitance towards it, but then we get them to overcome that by tasting something delicious. Fear is another one that we wanted to work with, and we thought that's something that there's all sorts of things with food that people are afraid of. I mean, we have so many fears linked to food, which for me as well even comes down to something very innate, where even if you put a little bit of syrup or something sweet on a baby's lips, they'll try and take it in because it's energy. If you put something bitter, we'll try and kind of expel it. There's all sorts of things that we dislike about food. So fear was another one that we wanted to tap into. Again, it wasn't actually making people feel fearful, but it was just bringing that emotion into the mind. How does this work with magic?
I mean, there's two parts to this question, really. I mean, the first was an engagement, and that's the key in magic. You can't perform magic without people actually engaging in what you are doing, and so you are taking your audience on a journey, and that is completely necessary, because as a magician, it's impossible for me to misdirect a person's attention if they're not attending to what you're doing in the first place. So that level of engagement is essential for any magic trick to work. And the emotions play a fundamental role in any magic experience. Some magicians play around with emotions much more so than other magicians. And I think your idea of exploring negative emotions is a really interesting one, because magic in some ways it should be a negative experience. I mean, you mentioned the deception, but also it can be incredibly confusing as well. It can be quite frightening as well. And I think one of the things that really captivates people about magic is not just the humour or the funny, sort of the funny emotional experiences, but it's some of these negative emotional experiences as well. And the key to this is being able to embrace these experiences within a safe environment. If you think about the lying, if I'm talking to you now, if I'm just lying to you, you wouldn't really like this. I mean, that would be, it will feel like quite an offensive experience. Whilst if I'm telling you, okay, look, I'm going to show you a magic trick, as soon as I've set those parameters of framing this as a magic performance, then anything is possible and any forms of deception and lying are completely acceptable. And the key to this is being able to experience these negative emotions within a safe environment. If you can do that, then these negative experiences and emotions can be experienced as something very positive. In the same way you go and watch a horror film, for example, you see some really negative, really horrendous things. If you'd see them on your way back from the cinema, that would be very unpleasant, but because you know that you're in a movie theatre, it's a safe environment, and so you can actually embrace these negative experiences. And it's probably the same with the jellyfish as well. If I'm walking down on the beach in Cornwall and there's a jellyfish lying on the beach, there's no way I would try that because it looks absolutely disgusting. But if you're in a dining experience where you feel, okay, I'm safe, I'm not going to be poisoned by any of this, it's likely to taste nice, then I think playing around with these emotions can be really exciting, in the same way that's what magic does, and that's what all good art does. It elicits strong emotional experiences. They can be positive but also negative. If you can embrace them in a safe environment, that can be a very powerful psychological force.
And you mentioned an interesting thing there about kind of magic and art, and I'm sure there are many magicians that feel like many chefs that see what they do as an art form, that there's so much detail and practice and learning and technique and method that go into this. And so how can we bring magic into the dining experience in some way? Do we need years and years of practice and training, or are there elements of psychology and magic that could be brought into dining experiences by those who aren't magicians?
Well, to become an expert magician takes many years. We ran a study interviewing about 100 professional magicians, and it takes on average about 15,000 hours of practice to become a professional magician. I tried to do this calculation myself, and I think I probably spent about 20,000 hours practicing magic tricks. But that is not to mean that, some tricks are really difficult, some require a lot of thinking behind them, but actually once you've worked it out, once you've got the recipe for this, you can teach this to other people as well. So in some of our work, we're interested in looking at the impact that learning to perform magic can have on people's self-esteem. And we teach people a magic trick. It takes about 15 minutes or so to teach the magic trick, and then they can actually perform it. And that is quite a powerful transformation, where they get to see a magic trick that they feel is impossible, there's no way they could do it, and we teach it. And okay, it's not great, but they can do something that appeared completely impossible beforehand. And there's lots of self-working magic tricks that can be performed relatively easily. This is why magic is also used in theatre as well. You don't have to be an expert sleight of hand magician to create all types of magic. They are self-working magic tricks that, if you perform them in the appropriate context, can actually elicit some very powerful experiences.
Because the David Devant, the magic trick that we were talking about with the kettle that poured the various different liquids, that seems like a great front of house kind of sommelier's magic trick, right?
Yeah, it's a great trick. I mean, I don't actually know how it's done. I was just offered a little booklet that describes it, so you can buy it online. The method. I don't know how much skill is involved in that, but yeah, there's lots of magic tricks that really don't involve that much skill and appear very impressive.
Actually, that begs an interesting question. When you watch magic shows, or do you have a relatively do you try and analyze how things have been done? Is it quite obvious in some cases, or how entertaining is it for you?
I love watching magic, and most magicians love watching magic as well. So the appeal doesn't go away. We look out for different things. A lot of magic tricks I will know how they are done, but then always love being surprised and fooled by other magic tricks as well. And I guess it's a bit like you as a chef as well. I mean, I'm assuming that when you go to a restaurant, you will taste and experience a meal in a very different way to the way I do. And it just gives you a different appreciation for the art form.
Well, drawing that parallel as well, as a chef, I love going out and trying, other places. And as you said, there's a certain part of it as well is just enjoying seeing how other chefs use ingredients and looking at the combinations and so on and so forth. In the world of gastronomy, there's constantly, I guess, chefs are constantly looking for new and interesting methods and techniques in the kitchen, and the last 20 years have really opened up a lot of opportunities because of more of a scientific perspective being taken in the kitchen. So really having molecular gastronomy is probably a popular term for it, but this idea of taking on board a more scientific perspective on cooking. So that's taking great ingredients, never about kind of taking average ingredients and doing something with science to make them better, but taking great ingredients, but just because of the science, knowing how to handle them better and prepare them, cook them, to bring out the best in them. A lot of chefs are looking for new, interesting, fun ways of bringing foods to the table and new techniques. Is that the same with magic? Are people constantly looking for new ways to engage and new tricks? Is that the case?
Yeah, there's been a constant evolution of magic tricks really since the 15th century. We go to magic conventions where we attend lectures by master magicians giving new takes on old tricks, but also developing new techniques as well. And I think one of the really big differences or big revolutions in magic has been the internet for magicians. A lot of magicians are very scared of secrets being revealed online, but in actual fact I think that online revolution has really turbocharged the development of a lot of magic tricks. So if I think of myself, I mean, I was born in the 1970s, before the internet, and as a kid I just went to loads of libraries and bookshops to get average magic books, and it took a long time for me to get taken up into magic societies and then get to read about more expert types of magic tricks from expert books. Now it doesn't. Anyone can go online and you can type in magic into YouTube or find tutorials online, and that has really accelerated the development of new tricks, but also just the way that the young kids are now learning magic tricks. I mean, I watch young kids performing their sleight of hand, and they are far better than I ever was, simply because they managed to access all of that information from a much earlier age, which has facilitated the learning of new magic tricks. But I guess kind of like, I mean, I think in terms of combining magic and gastronomy, it doesn't. There is the magic as an art form, and there is that really high skill level of magic performances. But it's important to point out that there are a lot of tricks, and in the same way that perceptual tricks can be used in magic as well, or in dining, that could potentially be implemented to create really interesting experiences.
And well, you mentioned there this idea of, so if we take chefs and we try and get them to understand a little bit more about magic, could we in some way engage people further into the dining experience through that kind of emotional engagement? Because you mentioned something about sympathetic magic, and I like that idea earlier. How could that, well, what is sympathetic magic first, and maybe then we can take it from there.
So sympathetic magic is this idea that that magical essence can be transformed into objects as well, and it tries to explain a lot of our beliefs in real magic. And there's several key concepts to sympathetic magic. One of them is this law of similarity, whereby so if you've got an object that resembles another object, that in some ways they are magically connected. And there were some really interesting studies back in the 1990s on sympathetic magic, looking at this impact of negative contagion, for example. So if you've got a piece of chocolate that is shaped as a poo, people generally wouldn't like to eat it. Similarly, if you've got a rubber vomit on the table, even though you know it's made of rubber, it just feels really disgusting. Or some studies where they used a sterilized cockroach and dropped a sterilized cockroach into someone's drink, and most people are reluctant to drink the water even though the cockroach has been sterilized. So this is, and the reason why we don't like these objects is because of this idea of negative contagion. So rationally we know that the look of an object doesn't have a direct impact on the taste of it. Irrationally, or almost magically, there's some magical essence that can be transmitted into that object, and it changes our appreciation for those objects.
And so what's the positive side of this?
So the positive side would be, for example, objects that have been endorsed by celebrities.
Right.
I mean, if you think about a T-shirt that's been worn by your favourite sports person, we value those kind of objects really highly. More
than just an object. It becomes now it's transformed in some way into having a greater meaning.
Yeah, and our sentimental attachment to objects as well. So my wedding ring, for example, if I'd lose this, I could go and buy another one. I could buy an identical copy of this. Yeah, it just simply wouldn't feel the same. So that will be a form of positive contagion as well. And so these are very powerful psychological principles. And again, especially with taste, they are incredibly important. I mean, you mentioned our problem with eating insects. The main reason is if you see an insect, you just don't want to eat it. It's probably independent of the actual taste itself, and yet these psychological principles are very powerful. And again, so magic allows us to magically transform objects, and it'd be really interesting to explore whether magical essence can be transmitted into culinary items to see whether that changes our appreciation for them.
So when I mentioned something like jellyfish, one of the interesting concepts behind that dish for us was this idea of kind of behavioural change, because if you think about designing or wanting to encourage people to eat more nutritious, sustainable foods, a lot of it does come down to behavioural change as opposed to just trying to get them to switch their diets, because you want them to enjoy food. That's a huge part of them getting the right enjoyment, satiety from what they're eating. But at the same time, could be for various reasons, health or diet or lifestyle, that people want to eat different types of foods. Behavioral change is a huge part of that. How important is that within magic and the psychology of magic, this idea of kind of changing people's perceptions?
Yeah, well, that plays a very important role. I mean, this is one of the things that we are trying to do. So one of the projects that we are looking at the moment are studying different mind control techniques, which is a principle known as forcing. So in a card trick, for example, I could get you to simply choose a playing card and you feel that you had a free choice. But in actual fact, we can use lots of psychological tricks to get you to choose the object or the card that we want you to choose. And one of the reasons why we're interested in understanding the psychology behind these principles is that they could be applied to get people to make more healthier choices as well, or trying to change their behaviour for the better. So if you've got different food, if you've got a whole range of different food items, how can we actually get people to choose the more healthy snack, for example? Now, of course, a lot of consumer psychologists have already used a lot of these principles to get you to buy the sugary stuff.
So is it just rediscovering these ideas and trying to apply them in the right way? Because I feel like even with the research that we do with Professor Spence, a lot of the ideas or concepts, hypothesis, you kind of feel in a way that big food like your Nestle's and Mars and, I don't know, McDonald's of the world have been implementing these ideas, whether it's intuitively or through their own research, for the last 50, 60, 70 years or so. Is that the same in this case?
I think maybe for some of them, but I think some of the other principles that we are actually looking at are really rather surprising. Magicians have been using them. I mean, one of the things about magic is because it's so secretive and it necessitates a certain level of secrecy, because otherwise magic doesn't really work. But I think by studying some of these lesser known principles, we are discovering new things. But one of the things that I'm always aware of, and one of the things I feel uncomfortable about as well, is, well, are these principles then really used for the good or for the bad? And that's one of the questions that's always at the back of our mind as well. But I think some advertisers have used, and marketing companies have used, a lot of these principles already.
And what kind of principles are we talking about here in terms of trying to encourage people to, let's say, eat the sugary foods? I guess packaging in terms of the colours and shapes and positioning within the supermarket.
Yeah,
are these the kind of elements you were talking about?
So we've just run some studies where, for example, if I place 4 cards on the table here, and I ask you just simply to touch one, I've selected that card. About 60% of the people will take the card that is third from the left, and they're completely unaware of that bias. And so what this illustrates is that if you actually ask someone to make a choice like that, we can predict which object they will choose. I mean, you could use the same thing probably with chocolate bars as well. But what's interesting about this is that even though these behaviours and these choices are highly predictable, people are generally not aware of the fact that they are behaving in such stereotypical ways, unless we actually encourage them to properly think about them. So if you actually ask them to think about the choice that they're going to be making before they actually make the selection, that significantly reduces some of these biases. So that can be used to get people to make genuinely more freer choices as well, or on the flip side, it can be used to actually influence the objects that they're really choosing.
So at Kitchen Theory, we're always looking for ways of kind of bringing new inspiration into what we do. And when I found out about your work, especially this, not just your work with magic, but specifically the psychology of magic, that obviously inspired with Charles the paper that we've written together, but it also got me thinking about how that there's this kind of missed opportunity in a way to bring magic into the dining experience, but rather than what we were talking about earlier, where it's kind of as a sideshow or that there's some kind of a break between the two. It would be great to explore how we could bring magic into each of the dishes that we do. So one, for example, a couple that I told you about that we'd worked on. One was padlocked petit fours. So we would do a simple kind of mental maths kind of trick where people would end up with the same number in mind, and they'd enter that into their padlock, and then they'd unlock it and be able to get their petit fours. Another was inspired by Derren Brown's stage show Miracle, where he got I think it was one of the audience members to smash a light bulb and then eat it. And she looked absolutely petrified. Thankfully, our guests don't look petrified when we do it with them. They quickly figure out that we've fashioned the light bulbs in a way that makes them edible. But do you think there's room for more of this? Do you think there's from a chef's point of view, I see there being missed opportunity. From a magician's point of view, what would you say?
Yeah, I think there's a massive opportunity there, because in some ways this is exactly what a lot of magicians, or the more creative magicians, are really striving for as well. As I said before, their bread and butter work is table hopping magic, where you do exactly the same trick over and over again for a large number of people. And I mean, one of the reasons why I don't work as a professional magician anymore is because I just simply don't like it, because in a lot of the situations, the magic actually interferes with the dining experience. So you go up to a table, you break their conversation, and you show some tricks, and then that's it. Like, people will talk about the tricks afterwards, but there's very little proper engagement like that. And I think the idea of actually creating magic tricks that are specially designed for a certain dining experience, and trying to bring the multisensory aspect of magic, bringing that together as well. I think there's so many opportunities that could be, that could be explored within that context.
So if people want to know more about your work, you obviously have your book, which is Experiencing the Impossible, the Science of Magic. Any other resources would you direct people to? There's the Magic Lab.
Yeah, so there's our Magic Lab website. So if you go to Goldsmiths University, the Magic Lab, you can learn more about a lot of the projects that we're doing there. If you're more interested in the psychology of magic more generally as well, we've got the Science of Magic Association, which is an organisation that brings together magicians and scientists as a way of exploring the science of magic more systematically as well.
What kind of disciplines do the scientists come from, out of interest?
At the moment, there seems to be a dominance of psychologists, but we've got a lot of computer scientists as well, people from the humanities as well, from theatre practice. So it's a very interdisciplinary group, and we've got our next conference here in London as well in 2022. So we have international conferences that bring all of these different areas together as well, but also just trying to explore ways in which we can use magic and apply it to other domains.
Amazing. Gustav, thank you ever so much for joining us on the podcast, and hopefully we'll be bringing some magic to the table, quite literally, here at Kitchen Theory.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.